Now let's take that and let's look at why it's important that we address this in an international context. And that's because we're running into a brick wall. And the brick wall we're running into is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And they are more fearsome and formidable economic competitors than anybody that we've dealt with over the past 50 years when we were the dominant economic player. And they have substantial populations. They have, which is important for them. They spend a much smaller percentage of their money, with the exception of Russia, a much smaller percentage of their GDP on defense. So they have more money to invest in other areas. And third is the countries that where they're located, they have stronger central governments. So if they want to turn things on a dime, they have the capability, which they did from 2008 to 2009, and I'll share some statistics with you. They have the capability to respond quickly. Before I look at Brazil, I'm going to look at India and China specifically, but I want to talk about what we as business people do when we're doing strategic planning. One of the first things we do is we do what's called a competitive analysis. And competitive analysis is the traditional strategic planning approaches do a SWOT analysis. It's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And I started doing a SWOT analysis on the United States of America. Well, actually, this first slide is not mine. It's from a guy named Michael Porter from the Harvard Business School. He developed the competitive analysis approach. And he put this slide together back in April of 2009, and we probably agree with most of the things on the slide in April of 2009. But if we start looking at where we are in 2010, I don't know if the strengths are quite as strong as they were in 2009, and I'm not certain that the weaknesses are that we are not weaker than we were in 2009. Now here's a slide that we put together, my co-authors, for our book. And we said, okay, here's some traditional American strengths. Go down that column on the strength side. Small business, our democracy, free media, citizen initiatives, world leadership. Those are hallmarks of our country as strengths. Even today, we're diminished in some capacities, I think, on almost every one of those items. So our strengths are not as strong. In strategic planning, what you do is you leverage your strengths and you correct your weaknesses. Well, let me highlight just 3 weaknesses on this slide. First weakness is the weakness of having a crumbling infrastructure. In the modern world, if you travel around the world, and I do and have, you go into the other countries and there are huge investments in infrastructure. We have a deficit in infrastructure expenditures of somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion just to, not to become state of the art, just to bring everything up to speed. So we have a huge deficit in infrastructure investment. It's a major need. A second deficit that we have, and I'm going to beat this horse again, is in the manufacturing arena. We still innovate here, but we invent it here and we make it over there. And if we can't invent it here and make it there, then the technological edge that we have historically had, we have abandoned. So we need to invent it here and make it here. So that's part of restoring competitive advantage. And the third point that I want to talk about here just briefly is congressional dysfunctionality. And that is an issue for us. It's an issue that would have been, I think, we would be even more traumatic with the exception of the unfortunate occurrence in Tucson. We'd be in the middle of a debate in Washington, D.C. on health care that would be, I think, would be no holds barred. But the thing I want to say about congressional dysfunctionality is that we talked a little bit about fair districting. We have a broken governmental system, and no matter who we put into these jobs, unless we can correct the rules of the game, if you let the filibuster stand, if you let cloture stand, if you let these things stay the same, if we don't look at changing primary systems, how the primaries are conducted, if we don't look at campaign finance reform, if we can't make those top agendas items at the top of the list, we'll send our very best, some of our very best people, and I know a lot of elected officials, I know officials from here, I know a number of them in Washington, D.C., and they get it, and they get in there and they're almost handcuffed by the system that they're caught up in. Now, I know that they're going to introduce some legislation to try to deal with the filibuster. Tom Udall's going to do that. But those things have to be dealt with because they hamper our ability to be effective. So those are strengths and weaknesses. Let's take a quick look at India as a competitor, and then we're going to look briefly at China, and then I'll come back and talk about what do we do about all this. And I want to go back, circle back and talk about the Tea Party just briefly. India, here's some facts up here. Look at the GDP numbers for India. At the same time, we had negative GDP. Look at 2008, 2009. India this year is going to have a growth of about 9% GDP. Now, we're not going to grow as fast as India. We can't. We're a much more developed economy. But we have to grow at a certain rate at 3.5% to 4% to be competitive. India has a population of about 1 billion people. Some of its main strengths are it's superior in math and science. It's got business expertise. They're very skilled business people. The weaknesses of India, it's got infrastructure, healthcare problems, and they have some enormous pockets of poverty. They have the area, if you saw Slumdog Millionaire, I mean, you know what I'm talking about. So those are issues, but they've got a more centralized government. One advantage they also is they are a democracy. They are already fourth in the world in terms of GDP, purchase power parity, which means if you can look at them and match them up, they are already fourth in the world. So they're a power that's not, that's why President Obama visited there. They're critical as partners going forward. Now, China. Remember back in the early 80s when Japan came in and Japan was going to clean our clocks, and in some ways they did, in some ways they didn't. But I look at China and I see they are Japan on steroids. If you thought we had problems in dealing with Japan, dealing with China, and is 1.3 billion people in China, some enormous strengths, some of which come from the fact that they've made incredible investments in infrastructure. I mean, my friends that have gone over to China recently are just stunned to see what they've done in the country. The other thing that they've done is they're creating a whole new middle class, plus they're creating a privileged class in China, of all places. Forbes magazine, about, I think it was in October, November, said there are 117 billionaires and thousands of millionaires in China. Now, I couldn't fact check that, but it was in Forbes, so it had to be true, right? Whatever. All I'm saying is that they have enormous strengths. They have infrastructure. The other thing is they've made significant, important investments. Investments they've made, U.S. Treasury bonds, dominant holder of Treasury bonds. Investments, Australian iron ore. They control the iron ore in Australia. African farmlands. So they are the first, talk about diversifying your portfolio. They understand this. They understand that they need to grow both domestically and internationally. They of course have weaknesses just as we do. And the weaknesses include that they have rural development, underdevelopment and unrest. They have also started to hit some problems in terms of their environmental situation, but their GDP in 2000 and 2010 will be somewhere between 10 and 11% growth. That's after significant GDP growth in 2008 and 2009. The number that I want to, it's not a number, but the fact I want to share with you is They manufacture more, they manufacture more cars in China than we do here. They weren't supposed to catch us until 2020. They're number 2 in GDP, and they passed Japan. They weren't supposed to pass Japan until 2025. So we should not take this lightly. We, as American citizens, need to understand that the Republican is not our enemy, and the Democrat is not our enemy. We should have a common cause, and the common cause is to gain competitive advantage in the world again. I want to talk a little bit about that, how I think we could go about starting to do that. And let me talk about Enterprise USA.